For most of human history, recovery was not something bought, prescribed, or packaged. It happened quietly, inside bodies that slowed down in darkness, repaired tissue during sleep, adjusted to hunger, and responded to movement, rest, light, and time. Modern life did not erase those older systems, but it often drowns them out. So what is this free healing process the human body still carries, and why does it so rarely appear in anything we call treatment? There is a quiet moment that most people overlook, a moment so ordinary that it rarely feels important, and yet it is where the body begins to repair itself without waiting for permission, without waiting for a diagnosis, and without waiting for any form of treatment to begin, because long before humans learned to name diseases or create medicines, the body had already developed ways to respond to damage, imbalance, and fatigue in a slow and continuous rhythm that does not stop simply because attention is elsewhere. And if you think carefully about it, you can notice this in the smallest experiences, such as how a cut on the skin gradually closes without instruction, how soreness fades after rest, how clarity returns after sleep, and how the body seems to reorganize itself even when no deliberate action is taken, suggesting that recovery is not something introduced from the outside, but something that unfolds from within, guided by processes that have been shaped across a very long evolutionary history, where survival depended not on external intervention, but on the ability of the organism to maintain itself under changing and often difficult conditions. And this becomes easier to understand when we place the human body back into its original context, where there were no controlled environments, no consistent food supply, no artificial light extending the day, and no structured system of care, meaning that any organism that could not stabilize itself after injury, exhaustion, or infection would simply not persist. So what we now call healing is not a special state, but a continuous background activity, a form of maintenance that is always present, adjusting, repairing, and recalibrating, even when the conscious mind is focused elsewhere. And yet, in modern life, this constant activity often becomes less visible, not because it has disappeared, but because attention has shifted toward more immediate and measurable interventions, which can create the impression that recovery only begins when something is prescribed, when in reality, many foundational processes have already been underway long before that moment, quietly maintaining internal balance through mechanisms that do not announce themselves. And this raises a subtle but important question, because if the body is already engaged in ongoing repair, then what exactly is being added when treatment appears? And what role does that underlying system continue to play beneath it, especially when we consider that many aspects of modern life may not align with the conditions under which these processes evolved, such as extended periods of wakefulness, reduced physical movement, and constant exposure to artificial environments that can alter the signals the body relies on to regulate itself, leading to a situation where the system is still present but may not function in the same way it once did, not because it is flawed, but because the context around it has changed. And so instead of asking why the body sometimes fails to recover as expected, it may be more useful to ask what conditions it was originally adapted to recover within, and whether those conditions still exist in recognizable form today, because the answer to that question begins to reveal that what seems like a missing form of treatment may in fact be a mismatch between an ancient biological system and a modern environment that does not always support its natural rhythm. And once this possibility is considered, the idea of a free healing system becomes less mysterious and more grounded in observable patterns of how the body behaves over time, not as a replacement for medical care, but as a foundational layer that has always been there, working quietly beneath everything else, waiting not to be activated, but simply to be allowed to continue in the way it was shaped to do. If we slow down and remain with this idea a little longer, it becomes possible to notice that the body does not divide its work into moments of healing and moments of not healing, but instead maintains a continuous effort to keep internal conditions within a range that allows life to persist. And this effort does not wait for clear signals of damage before it begins, because much of what the body manages is not visible at the surface level, where small imbalances are constantly being corrected before they grow into something that would be recognized as illness. And this quiet correction can be understood as a form of background stability where temperature is adjusted, fluids are redistributed, chemical signals are balanced, and cellular components are maintained in a state that allows them to function, all without requiring conscious awareness. And when we consider this in the context of human evolution, it becomes clear that such a system would not be optional, because early humans lived in environments where external help was limited or absent, meaning that the ability to maintain internal balance would have been one of the most reliable factors supporting survival over long periods of uncertainty. And yet, in modern settings, this continuous activity is often overlooked because attention tends to focus on moments when the system appears to fail or when intervention becomes necessary, creating a kind of selective awareness where only the disruptions are noticed while the ongoing maintenance remains invisible, and this can lead to a misunderstanding of how much of recovery is already taking place before any deliberate action is introduced, especially when we think about experiences like gradual fatigue that resolves after rest or minor discomfort that fades without specific treatment, which are not random improvements but expressions of underlying processes that are adjusting and recalibrating over time. And this brings us back again to the conditions under which these processes evolved, because the body did not develop in an environment of constant stimulation, irregular schedules, or prolonged inactivity, but rather in a context where periods of effort were followed by periods of rest, where light and darkness followed a predictable cycle, and where movement was distributed throughout the day instead of concentrated into isolated intervals, allowing the body to align its internal processes with external cues that signaled when to conserve energy and when to expend it. And when these cues are consistent, the system can operate in a way that appears smooth and reliable. But when they are disrupted, the same system may still function, though not with the same clarity or efficiency, which can create the impression that something is missing or broken, when in fact the underlying mechanisms are still present but are operating in conditions that do not fully support them. And this distinction is important because it shifts the focus away from the idea that recovery must always be initiated from outside the body, and instead suggests that many of the processes associated with healing are already active, though sometimes less visible or less effective depending on the surrounding context. And once this is recognized, it becomes easier to see that what appears to be the absence of a solution may instead be a quiet system continuing to work under conditions that have gradually drifted away from those in which it was originally shaped, maintaining its effort not as a reaction to a specific problem, but as an ongoing requirement of staying alive in a changing world. If this continuous effort is always present, then the next question becomes quieter but more difficult, because it asks not what the body can do, but what allows it to do what it already does. And in this sense, the idea of a healing system begins to shift away from something that must be activated towards something that depends on conditions that either support or interfere with it. And when we return again to the long span of human history, we begin to see that the body's ability to maintain itself was not built for environments filled with constant interruption, but for rhythms that repeated with a certain regularity, where light faded and returned, where activity rose and fell, and where periods of stillness were not rare but expected. And within those repeating patterns, the body could organize its internal processes in a way that allowed repair to unfold without conflict, because many of the mechanisms involved in maintenance do not operate well when signals are mixed or when demands are extended beyond their usual range. And this is not a flaw, but a reflection of how the system was shaped, since in earlier environments, the boundaries between effort and rest were clearer, and the body could rely on those boundaries to allocate energy toward different tasks, shifting from movement to recovery, from alertness to restoration, without needing to sustain all states at once. And yet in modern life, those boundaries often become blurred, as wakefulness extends into hours that were once reserved for darkness, as movement becomes compressed into short periods rather than spread across the day, and as mental activity continues even when physical rest begins, creating a situation where the body is asked to maintain multiple states simultaneously, which can dilute the clarity of the signals that guide its internal work. And when this happens, the processes of repair do not disappear, but they may become less coordinated, less efficient, and more difficult to notice, not because the system has been lost, but because the environment no longer provides the same cues that once aligned its activity, and this leads to an important distinction, because it suggests that what feels like a lack of healing may sometimes be a lack of conditions that allow healing to proceed in its usual way. And this does not mean that the body is incapable, but that it is responding to a different set of inputs than those it was originally adapted to interpret. And as a result, the The same mechanisms that once operated smoothly may now appear inconsistent or delayed, which can reinforce the belief that recovery must come from outside, rather than recognizing that a foundational layer is still present, continuing its work in the background, adjusting, compensating, and maintaining as best it can within the limits of the current environment. And if we look even more closely, we can begin to see that this system does not rely on urgency or intensity, but on continuity, meaning that small, repeated patterns over time shape how effectively the body can maintain itself. And this is consistent with how evolution tends to favor processes that are stable and sustainable, rather than those that depend on rare or extreme conditions. Because survival across generations is more often supported by what can be repeated reliably than by what can be achieved once with great effort. And this helps explain why many aspects of recovery feel slow or subtle, not because they are weak, but because they are designed to operate within a steady rhythm that can be maintained across long periods, even when resources are limited or conditions are imperfect. And when that rhythm is present, the body can distribute its work in a way that preserves function over time, but when that rhythm is disrupted, the same processes may still occur, though with less coordination and less visible effect. And so the question that begins to emerge is not whether the body has lost its ability to heal, but whether the patterns of daily life still provide the signals that allow that ability to express itself clearly, or whether something small and gradual has shifted in a way that makes a constant process feel unexpectedly distant, even though it has never truly stopped. If we move further back, beyond the structures of modern life and into a time where human survival depended almost entirely on the body's own capacity to endure and recover, the idea of healing begins to take on a different shape, because it was not something separate from daily life, but something woven directly into it, unfolding alongside movement, rest, hunger, and exposure to the environment. And in that setting, there was no clear moment when recovery began, because there was no external system marking its start, no prescription signaling a transition from illness to treatment, only a continuous adjustment to changing conditions, where the body had to stabilize itself using whatever resources were available at that moment. And this becomes easier to understand when we consider that for most of human history, injuries were often minor but frequent. Energy availability could shift from day to day, and environmental stresses such as temperature, terrain, and food scarcity were constant factors that required ongoing adaptation, meaning that the body could not rely on waiting for ideal conditions before beginning repair, but instead had to operate within the constraints of the present, redistributing energy, prioritizing essential functions, and gradually restoring balance over time. And this pattern would have been reinforced across generations, not as a conscious strategy, but as a biological necessity, where individuals whose bodies could maintain internal stability despite external variability were more likely to persist. And over long periods, this would shape a system that does not depend on precision or control, but on flexibility and resilience, allowing recovery to proceed even when circumstances are not optimal. And yet this flexibility also has limits, because while the system can adapt to a range of conditions, it still relies on certain patterns that provide signals for when to conserve energy and when to expend it. And in earlier environments, these signals were often clearer, as light followed a predictable cycle, physical activity was distributed throughout the day, and rest was more closely aligned with darkness, creating a structure that allowed the body to coordinate its internal processes with external cues. And when we observe this more closely, it becomes possible to imagine a day in which activity rises gradually with light, continues in varied forms rather than in fixed blocks, and then slows as darkness returns, allowing the body to transition into a different internal state without abrupt interruption. And within that pattern, recovery is not something that needs to be scheduled or forced, because it is already embedded in the rhythm itself. And this is important because it shows that healing, in its most basic form, is not an event but a condition that emerges when certain patterns are present. And when those patterns repeat over time, the body can anticipate them, aligning its internal processes in advance, rather than reacting after imbalance has already occurred. And this anticipatory quality is one of the less visible aspects of the body's maintenance system, where adjustments begin before discomfort becomes noticeable, helping to prevent larger disruptions from forming. And this is consistent with what we understand about biological systems more broadly, where stability is often maintained through continuous small corrections rather than through occasional large interventions. And yet when we contrast this with the modern environment, where light can extend indefinitely, activity can be irregular, and rest can be fragmented, it becomes possible to see how the same system might still function but with less clarity, not because it has changed fundamentally, but because the signals it uses to organize its work have become less consistent, and this inconsistency can make the timing of recovery feel unpredictable, as if the body is no longer following a stable pattern, even though the underlying mechanisms remain in place, continuing to respond as best they can to the information available, and so the experience of healing begins to shift, not because the system itself has been replaced, but because the context in which it operates has gradually moved away from the conditions that once supported its rhythm, and this leads to a subtle but important shift in how recovery is perceived, because instead of feeling like a continuous background process, it may appear delayed, incomplete, or dependent on intervention, when in fact the underlying mechanisms are still active, though operating in a context that does not always support their natural timing. And so as we begin this next stage of the exploration, the focus is not on what has been added to human health in recent history, but on what has always been present, functioning quietly across generations, maintaining life not through dramatic events, but through steady and often unnoticed adjustments that allowed the human body to persist long before it could be observed, measured, or described in the way it is today. And this perspective does not remove the importance of modern medicine, but it places it alongside a much older system, one that does not replace or compete, but continues underneath, shaping the baseline from which all other forms of intervention begin. If we continue within this earlier setting, where human life unfolded without the structures that now define modern care, it becomes easier to see that the body did not simply endure its environment, but constantly adjusted to it in ways that were often gradual and distributed across time, rather than concentrated into single moments of change. And this is important because it suggests that recovery was not a separate phase that followed disruption, but something that occurred alongside it, where even as the body was being challenged, it was also working to stabilize itself. And this dual process can be understood by considering how energy was managed, because in an environment where food was not guaranteed and effort could not always be reduced, the body had to make continuous decisions about where to allocate its resources, shifting attention between movement, repair, immune function, and basic maintenance in a way that did not rely on clear boundaries. And instead of waiting for full rest before beginning to recover, the body would distribute its efforts across whatever conditions were available, repairing small amounts where possible, delaying larger tasks when necessary, and maintaining essential functions even when resources were limited. And over long periods, this would create a system that is not optimized for perfect conditions, but for persistence under imperfect ones, allowing recovery to occur even when it is incomplete or interrupted. And when we place this within the broader frame of human evolution, it becomes clear that such a system would have been favored, because survival did not depend on achieving ideal states, but on maintaining enough stability to continue. And this perspective changes how we understand the idea of healing, because it suggests that what we often think of as a failure to recover may sometimes be the body maintaining balance at a level that allows survival, even if it does not meet the expectations of full restoration. And this becomes more visible when we compare different types of strain, such as physical fatigue that accumulates gradually and resolves over time, or minor injuries that do not receive focused treatment but still improve, not through a single event, but through a series of small adjustments that occur as the body redistributes its resources. And in earlier environments, these patterns would have been common, where recovery was often partial, ongoing, and interwoven with continued activity, rather than separated into distinct periods of rest and repair. And yet this does not mean that the body was constantly under strain, because there were also natural variations in activity, where certain periods allowed for more complete restoration, particularly when environmental conditions reduced the need for immediate effort. And these moments would have provided opportunities for the body to shift its internal priorities more fully toward maintenance, reinforcing the idea that recovery is not a fixed process, but one that expands or contracts depending on the context. And when we bring this understanding into the present, it becomes possible to see how modern expectations of recovery, which often assume clear transitions between activity and rest, may not always align with the way the body was shaped to function, because the body does not require perfect separation to begin its work, but it does rely on patterns that allow its efforts to accumulate over time. And when those patterns are inconsistent, the sense of recovery can become less defined, not because the processes have stopped, but because they are being distributed in a way that is harder to perceive. And this can lead to the impression that something is missing, when in fact the system is still active, though operating within a different structure of time and demand than the one it originally adapted to. And so the question that continues to develop is not whether the body has lost its ability to repair, but whether the way time, effort, and rest are organized in modern life still allows those small, continuous adjustments to build toward a noticeable sense of recovery, or whether they remain present but fragmented, never fully accumulating into the experience that we expect to feel. If this pattern of distributed recovery continues over long periods, then it begins to suggest something that is easy to miss when viewed only through modern expectations, because it implies that the body is not waiting for a perfect moment to restore itself, but is instead accumulating small adjustments that gradually move it towards stability, and this accumulation does not depend on any single condition being ideal, but on the repeated presence of conditions that are sufficient, even if they are not optimal. And when we return again to the environments in which the human body evolved, we can begin to see how this would have shaped a system that values continuity over intensity, where the consistency of basic patterns matters more than the precision of any individual moment. And this becomes clearer when we imagine how daily life may have unfolded, with movements spread across uneven terrain, pauses that arise naturally rather than being scheduled, and periods of rest that are not always long or uninterrupted, but that still provide enough stability for the body to shift its internal priorities, even if only for a short time. And over many cycles, these small shifts would accumulate, allowing the body to maintain itself without requiring a complete separation between activity and recovery. And this is important because it challenges the assumption that healing must be concentrated into clearly defined periods, suggesting instead that much of it occurs in fragments that are later integrated into a broader pattern of stability. And yet this system also depends on the presence of signals that repeat with enough regularity to guide its timing, because without some degree of predictability, the body cannot anticipate when to allocate energy toward maintenance and must instead respond more reactively, which can reduce the efficiency of its efforts. And this is where the contrast with modern life becomes more visible, because when daily patterns become irregular, when light extends into hours that were once dark, when activity is compressed into limited periods and followed by long intervals of stillness, the signals that once guided the body's internal coordination can become less consistent, and although the underlying mechanisms remain in place, they may no longer align in the same way, leading to a sense that recovery is incomplete or delayed, even though the processes themselves have not stopped. And this misalignment does not mean that the body has lost its capacity, but that it is operating within a structure that does not fully support the way it organizes its work. And when we consider this over longer spans of time, it becomes possible to see how a system designed for continuity might struggle to produce clear outcomes in an environment that emphasizes interruption, because instead of building steadily toward restoration, its efforts may be repeatedly reset or diverted, preventing them from reaching the level at which they become noticeable. And this can create a subtle but persistent impression that something is missing, when in fact what is missing may be the conditions that allow small, ongoing processes to accumulate into a recognizable state of recovery. And so, as this part comes to a close, the question shifts once again, moving away from whether the body can heal, toward whether the patterns of modern life still allow its quiet, distributed efforts to gather enough continuity to be felt, or whether they remain present but scattered, always working, but rarely given the chance to fully come together. When people hear the word healing, the mind often moves immediately towards something visible and local, such as a cut closing, a bruise fading, or a broken bone slowly joining again, because these are the forms of recovery that can be seen from the outside and measured with relative ease. Yet the body's deeper work is often less dramatic and far less visible, and for that reason it is easier to miss, even though it may be more fundamental to survival than the repair of any single wound, because much of what keeps a human being alive is not the correction of obvious damage, but the quiet preservation of internal order, where temperature remains within a narrow range, blood chemistry is kept within limits, immune activity rises and falls instead of remaining fixed, and cells are continuously maintained so that larger breakdowns do not emerge. And this broader sense of healing matters for the title of this video, because if there is a free healing system in the body, it is unlikely to be one single mechanism acting alone, and much more likely to be a network of overlapping processes that preserve function before visible collapse begins. And when we return to the long history of the human species, this wider definition becomes even more important, because early humans did not survive mainly by waiting for severe damage and then correcting it, but by maintaining enough internal balance, day after day, to continue moving, resting, eating, reproducing, and enduring environmental change, which means that healing, in evolutionary terms, was never just about recovery after injury, but about the constant prevention of disorder inside a body that was always exposed to uncertainty from the outside. And once we begin to see it this way, many ordinary experiences take on a different meaning, because the return of alertness after rest, the gradual easing of soreness after exertion, the restoration of appetite after illness, and the settling of internal rhythms after disruption are not separate events, but expressions of the same general principle, which is that the body is always trying to return to workable balance, even if that balance is never perfect and never permanent. And this is why the idea of healing cannot be reduced to a dramatic turning point, since much of it takes place as regulation rather than rescue, as correction rather than crisis, and as continuity rather than sudden transformation. And that distinction becomes especially important in modern life, where people often notice the body only when it becomes uncomfortable, inflamed, exhausted, or clearly unwell, while ignoring the immense amount of invisible coordination required to avoid those states most of the time. And this selective attention can create the illusion that health is the absence of activity, when in truth health often depends on enormous biological activity, occurring quietly in the background, keeping tissues supplied, removing damaged components, adjusting chemical signals, and managing competing demands without ever appearing dramatic enough to be called healing in everyday language. And yet that background order is exactly what allows more visible forms of recovery to happen later. Because a wound cannot close properly in a body that cannot regulate itself, sleep cannot restore a person whose internal timing is persistently confused, and immune defense cannot function well without a wider system capable of shifting priorities and distributing energy. So before we speak about any single process, whether sleep, immune response, or cellular cleanup, we have to understand this larger frame, which is that the body heals not only by repairing what is broken, but by preserving enough internal coherence that life can continue despite constant pressure from the world around it. And this kind of order was never optional in the environments where humans evolved, because without it, no amount of strength, intelligence, or social cooperation would have been enough for the species to persist for long. And so the question slowly becomes more precise, because perhaps the hidden system we are looking for is not a secret cure at all, but the ancient ability of the body to hold itself together, quietly and continuously, before visible failure begins. If we continue to stay with this broader view, where healing is not limited to visible repair, but extends into the preservation of internal balance, then it becomes possible to see that many of the body's most important activities do not aim to fix damage after it appears, but to prevent instability from growing large enough to be noticed. And this prevention does not occur through a single pathway, but through many overlapping systems that continuously adjust to small changes. And one of the simplest ways to understand this is to notice how narrow the range of stability actually is, because the body does not function equally well under all conditions, but instead operates within limits that must be maintained with care. And when those limits begin to shift, even slightly, the body responds with a series of corrections that are often too subtle to detect, such as small changes in circulation, variations in hormone levels, adjustments in breathing, and shifts in cellular activity that help restore a workable state before larger disruption occurs. And when we place this within the long arc of human evolution, it becomes clear that such a system would have been essential because early humans did not have the ability to measure or intervene in these changes directly. And so survival depended on whether the body could manage them on its own, maintaining a form of internal consistency even as external conditions change from moment to moment. And this kind of consistency does not mean that the body remains unchanged, but that it remains within a range that allows function to continue, even if that range moves slightly over time. And this idea helps explain why healing often feels gradual rather than immediate, because it is not a single action, but the result of many small corrections accumulating in a direction that supports stability. And yet in modern life, this accumulation can become harder to perceive, not because the processes have stopped, but because attention is often drawn toward more noticeable interventions, while the quieter adjustments remain in the background. And this can create a gap between what the body is doing and what the mind expects to observe, leading to a situation where recovery feels absent unless it produces a clear and immediate change, even though much of it is unfolding in a slower and less visible way. And this difference in perception can shape how people interpret their own condition, because when improvement is not dramatic, it may be assumed that nothing is happening, when in fact the body may be moving steadily toward a more stable state, though not at a pace that stands out. And this brings us again to the role of environment, because the effectiveness of these small adjustments depends on whether the surrounding conditions allow them to accumulate without constant interruption. And in earlier human settings, where patterns of activity and rest followed more predictable cycles, the body would have had more opportunities to reinforce these corrections, gradually strengthening its internal balance over time. But in environments where those patterns are disrupted, the same corrections may still occur, though they may be repeatedly offset by new demands, making it more difficult for the system to settle into a stable rhythm. And this does not mean that healing has stopped, but that it is occurring in fragments, never fully consolidating into a clear sense of recovery. And so, as we continue to explore this idea, the focus remains on understanding healing not as a moment of change, but as a process of ongoing regulation, where the body is constantly adjusting itself within narrow limits, maintaining order through small, continuous efforts that rarely draw attention, but that form the foundation upon which all more visible forms of recovery depend. And once this is understood, the idea of a hidden system becomes less about discovering something new and more about recognizing something that has always been present, quietly sustaining the conditions necessary for life to continue. If we follow this idea to its deeper layer, then healing begins to look less like a response to damage and more like a continuous effort to prevent collapse. And this shift in perspective changes how we interpret many of the body's most ordinary experiences, because instead of seeing them as isolated events, we begin to understand them as part of an ongoing process that maintains a workable state across time. And this becomes especially clear when we consider that the body is never static, not even for a moment, as cells are constantly being replaced, molecules are continuously exchanged, and internal conditions are always adjusting in response to both internal signals and the external environment. And within this constant motion, stability is not achieved by remaining unchanged, but by remaining within limits that allow function to continue. And this requires an enormous amount of coordination that is rarely visible, because it does not produce dramatic outcomes unless something goes wrong. And when we return once again to the evolutionary context, this quiet coordination becomes even more meaningful, because early humans existed in environments where the margin between stability and failure could be narrow, and where the body's ability to maintain internal order, even under pressure, would have been one of the most important factors supporting survival. And this does not suggest that the body was always successful, but that over long periods, systems that could sustain balance under varying conditions were more likely to persist, shaping a form of regulation that does not depend on perfection, but on adaptability, allowing the body to remain functional even when conditions are less than ideal. And this adaptability is not unlimited, because every system has boundaries beyond which it cannot maintain stability, but within those boundaries the body can absorb a surprising amount of variation, adjusting its internal processes in ways that often go unnoticed. And this helps explain why healing can feel uneven or incomplete at times, because it is not a single pathway moving toward a fixed endpoint, but a collection of processes that are constantly negotiating between competing demands, allocating resources where they are needed most, and sometimes delaying less urgent tasks in order to preserve immediate function. And in modern life, this negotiation becomes more complex, because the signals that guide it are often less consistent than those found in earlier environments, where patterns of light, movement, and rest were more predictable. And when these signals become irregular, the body's internal coordination can become less aligned, not because the system has failed, but because it is receiving mixed information about how to distribute its efforts, and this can create a sense that recovery is fragmented, as if different parts of the system are working at different times without fully integrating, and yet beneath this fragmentation, the same fundamental processes remain active, continuing to maintain balance as best they can, even when conditions are not fully supportive. And so the idea of a hidden healing system begins to resolve into something more grounded, not a single mechanism waiting to be discovered, but a network of continuous adjustments that sustain life from moment to moment, often without recognition. And this realization does not diminish the importance of more visible forms of recovery, but it places them within a larger framework, where dramatic changes are supported by a background of steady regulation, and where the true strength of the body lies not only in its ability to repair what is broken, but in its ability to remain intact long enough for that repair to matter. And as this part comes to a close, the question becomes more refined, because it is no longer simply whether the body can heal, but how much of that healing is already happening in ways that are too constant to notice, and whether the modern environment allows those processes to align into something that can be felt or keeps them scattered just below the threshold of awareness. Among all the conditions that support the body's quiet work of repair, sleep may be the most familiar and the least fully appreciated, because nearly everyone has felt the difference between waking after true rest and waking after a night that was long in hours but poor in quality, and that difference can be difficult to describe with precision, yet it is deeply physical, as if the body has either resumed its internal order or failed to complete some part of it. And this matters because sleep is one of the clearest examples of a state in which the body continues working while conscious control recedes, allowing processes of maintenance, regulation, and restoration to unfold without the constant demands of waking activity. And when we think about the title of this video, this is one of the strongest places to begin looking for a healing system that costs nothing and appears in no prescription, not because sleep is a magical cure, and not because every problem can be solved by rest, but because sleep reveals something fundamental about the human organism, which is that the body was never designed to spend every hour in outward action, and instead depends on recurring periods in which attention withdraws, movement decreases, and internal priorities are reorganized around preservation rather than performance. And this pattern makes deep evolutionary sense, because for most of human history, sleep was not an optional wellness practice added to life after other tasks were complete, but a built-in condition around which life itself had to be arranged, shaped by darkness, temperature, safety, and the daily alternation between effort and stillness. And in that older setting, the body would have received clearer signals about when to shift away from active engagement with the environment and toward forms of internal work that are difficult to sustain during wakefulness. And although science continues to refine the details of exactly how different stages of sleep contribute to different functions, there is broad agreement that sleep is deeply involved in memory processing, hormonal regulation, immune activity, and the restoration of many ordinary bodily functions that become strained during the day, which means that sleep is not passive absence, but organized biological activity taking place in a different mode, one that cannot be fully replaced by waking efficiency or by simply pushing through fatigue. And this helps explain why the body often becomes less precise, less resilient, and less stable when sleep is repeatedly reduced or fragmented, because the issue is not only tiredness in the simple sense, but the repeated interruption of a state in which many systems normally recalibrate, and when that recalibration is delayed, the body may continue to function, but often in a more strained and less coordinated way, as though it is staying upright without fully catching up with itself. And this brings us back to the larger evolutionary mismatch that runs beneath so much of modern life, because the human body still carries systems shaped in a world where darkness limited activity, where light arrived gradually, and where social and environmental rhythms often place stronger boundaries around the transition into rest. Whereas now, artificial light, prolonged stimulation, irregular schedules, and mental overactivation can all blur the signals that once helped the body move more clearly into a restorative state. And when those signals are blurred, sleep may still occur, but not always with the same structure, timing, or depth that the body has long depended on. And so the importance of sleep in this discussion is not that it stands outside the body as a treatment, but that it reveals how much the body's own repair depends on recurring conditions that modern life can easily disturb. And once this is recognized, sleep no longer appears as a simple break from life, but as one of the oldest and most essential ways in which the body turns inward, reduces external demand, and continues the quiet labor of keeping a human being alive, coherent, and able to begin again the next day. If we look more closely at what happens when sleep begins, the transition itself already reveals something important, because it is not a simple switch from activity to inactivity, but a gradual shift in how the body organizes its priorities, where attention withdraws from the external world and internal processes begin to take a more central role. And this shift is not random, but follows patterns that have been shaped over a long evolutionary history, where the alternation between light and darkness provided a stable framework for when to engage with the environment and when to conserve energy. And within that framework, sleep became a recurring opportunity for the body to redistribute its resources, not by stopping all activity, but by changing the type of activity that is taking place. And this is why sleep cannot be fully understood as rest in the ordinary sense, because while movement decreases and awareness fades, many internal processes continue, and in some cases become more active than they are during wakefulness, supporting functions that are difficult to sustain when the body is engaged in constant interaction with the environment. And this includes aspects of immune regulation, hormonal balance, and the maintenance of tissues that experience strain during the day. And although the exact mechanisms are still being studied in detail, there is broad agreement that the structure of sleep, with its shifting stages, allows different forms of maintenance to occur at different times, suggesting that sleep is not a uniform state, but a sequence of conditions that the body cycles through in a predictable way. And this predictability is important, because it allows the body to anticipate when certain types of work can be carried out, organizing its internal processes around a rhythm that repeats across days and nights. And when this rhythm is stable, the body can align its efforts in a way that supports both immediate function and longer-term maintenance. But when the rhythm becomes irregular, the coordination between these processes can weaken, not because the underlying systems are lost, but because their timing becomes less synchronized. And this can lead to a situation where some aspects of recovery occur, while others are delayed, creating a sense that sleep has not fully restored the body, even if the duration appears sufficient. And this distinction becomes more visible when we consider that the body does not measure sleep only in hours, but also in the structure and timing of those hours, meaning that when sleep is fragmented, shifted, or repeatedly shortened, the internal sequence of processes may be altered, reducing the overall effectiveness of the period of rest. And this is where the connection to modern life becomes clearer, because many of the patterns that once supported consistent sleep have changed. As artificial light extends the day beyond natural limits, as social and work demands create irregular schedules, and as mental activity continues late into the night, all of which can interfere with the signals that guide the body into its restorative state. And when those signals are less clear, the transition into sleep may still occur, but not always in the same way, leading to a form of rest that is present but less aligned with the body's expectations. And this misalignment does not eliminate the body's ability to repair itself, but it can reduce the clarity and completeness of that repair, making it more difficult to perceive. And so as we continue to follow this thread, sleep begins to reveal itself, not as a simple pause, but as a structured and essential condition in which the body reorganizes its internal work, and the extent to which that work can unfold depends not only on the presence of sleep itself, but on how closely the surrounding environment still resembles the patterns that the body has long used to guide its most fundamental processes. If this structure of sleep is as important as it appears, then the question becomes not only whether sleep happens, but whether it happens in a way that still allows the body to complete the sequence of processes it has long depended on. And this is where the difference between simply being unconscious and being restored begins to emerge, because the body does not enter sleep as a single uniform state, but moves through a pattern that unfolds over time, where different phases appear and recede in a rhythm that the body seems to anticipate. and when that rhythm is allowed to proceed with relative continuity, the internal processes associated with maintenance and regulation can align with it, unfolding in coordination rather than in isolation. And this coordination is what gives sleep its restorative quality, not because it introduces something new, but because it provides the conditions under which existing processes can proceed without interruption. And when we consider this in the context of human evolution, it becomes easier to understand why such a pattern would have been stable for long periods, as the cycle of light and darkness imposed a natural boundary on activity, encouraging a regular alternation between engagement and withdrawal, and within that alternation, the body could organize its internal work in a way that repeated with enough consistency to become reliable. And yet in modern environments, this consistency is often reduced, as artificial light, social demands, and irregular schedules introduce variability into a system that was shaped around predictability. And when this variability becomes frequent, the body may still pass through the stages of sleep, but not always in the same sequence or duration, which can alter the way different processes are coordinated. And this does not mean that sleep loses its value, but that its effectiveness may depend more heavily on how well its structure is preserved. And this brings us back again to the idea of a hidden system, because if much of the body's maintenance depends on conditions that allow processes to align over time, then any disruption to those conditions may not stop healing entirely, but may fragment it, spreading it across moments that do not fully connect. And this fragmentation can be difficult to notice directly, because it does not always produce a clear signal of failure, but instead appears as a general sense that recovery is incomplete, as though the body has moved forward but not fully settled. And this sensation may lead to the belief that something additional is required from outside, when in fact the underlying system is still present, though not given the opportunity to operate in the way it was shaped to do. And this distinction is important because it shifts the focus away from searching for a missing element and toward understanding the conditions that allow existing processes to unfold with coherence. And when we return to the broader pattern of human life, this coherence depends not on perfection, but on repetition, on the steady presence of signals that guide the body through its cycles of activity and rest, allowing its internal work to accumulate rather than restart. And when those signals are present, sleep becomes more than a pause. It becomes a period in which the body gathers its scattered adjustments and integrates them into a more stable state. But when those signals are inconsistent, the same processes may continue, though without fully converging, leaving the impression that something essential has been lost, even though it remains quietly active beneath the surface, waiting for the patterns that once allowed it to become whole. There is a different way to understand healing that does not begin with building or adding, but with clearing and reorganizing. And this idea becomes easier to approach when we shift our attention away from visible repair and toward the quieter processes that take place at a much smaller scale, because within the body, survival is not only a matter of creating new structures, but also of maintaining the quality of what already exists. And this requires a continuous effort to identify, break down, and recycle components that are no longer functioning as they should. And although this activity is rarely noticed in daily life, it is fundamental to the stability of living systems, since without it, small defects would accumulate over time, gradually interfering with the ability of cells to carry out their roles. And when we return once again to the long arc of human evolution, it becomes clear that such a process would have been essential, because early humans did not live in conditions where damaged components could simply be replaced from outside. And so the body needed a way to manage its own internal quality, preserving what could still function and removing what could not. And this brings us to a concept that has been studied carefully in modern biology, and that gained wider attention when it was recognized at the highest level of scientific research, not as a sudden discovery of something new, but as a deeper understanding of a process that had always been present. And this process is often described as a form of cellular self-cleaning, where parts of the cell that are damaged, misfolded, or no longer needed are enclosed, broken down, and reused, allowing the cell to maintain its internal environment in a state that supports continued function. And although the details can become complex, the central idea remains simple and grounded, which is that life is sustained not only by what is built, but by what is carefully removed and reorganized over time. And this perspective was highlighted in a particularly clear way when Yoshinori Ohsumi was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for for his work in describing the mechanisms of this process, known as autophagy. And what makes this recognition important in the context of this video is not the prestige of the award itself, but the fact that it draws attention to a fundamental aspect of how the body maintains itself, one that does not rely on external input in the way that many treatments do, but instead operates continuously within cells, contributing to the broader system of stability that we have been tracing from the beginning. And when we place this idea alongside the earlier discussion of sleep and environmental rhythm, it begins to form part of a larger picture, where the body's ability to recover is not based on a single pathway, but on many processes that depend on conditions that allow them to proceed with enough continuity to be effective. And in the case of cellular maintenance, this includes the availability of energy, the balance of internal signals, and the timing of activity and rest, all of which can influence how efficiently the body is able to manage its internal components. And yet, even with these influences, the process itself does not stop, because it is not an optional feature, but a basic requirement of living systems operating quietly in the background whether or not it is noticed. And this is where the idea of a free healing system begins to take on a more precise meaning, not as a single intervention that can be applied at will, but as a collection of ongoing processes that sustain the integrity of the body over time, often without drawing attention. And when viewed in this way, healing becomes less about introducing something new and more about understanding how the body maintains itself through continuous renewal, where what is no longer useful is removed, what can be preserved is stabilized, and what needs to be rebuilt is gradually restored, all within a system that has been shaped across a very long history, long before it could be observed, measured, or described in scientific terms. And even now, much of its activity remains subtle, unfolding at a scale that is not directly visible, yet essential for everything that is. If we remain with this idea of the body maintaining itself by clearing and reorganizing rather than only building, then the role of this process becomes more subtle and more expansive at the same time, because it is not limited to moments of obvious strain, but continues under ordinary conditions, shaping how well the body can function over time. And this is important because it suggests that stability does not come only from adding new components, but from preserving the quality of what is already present. And when we consider this at the level of individual cells, it becomes easier to understand why such a process would be necessary. Since cells are constantly exposed to small forms of wear, including changes in protein structure, accumulation of byproducts, and gradual loss of efficiency in certain components, and without a way to manage these changes, even a small amount of damage, repeated over long periods, could interfere with the ability of the cell to carry out its role, and this would eventually affect the larger system of the body. And so what appears to be a quiet and local process is actually part of a wider effort to maintain function across many levels, from the smallest structures within a cell to the coordination of entire tissues. And when we place this within the evolutionary context once again, it becomes clear that such a system would not have emerged as an isolated feature, but as part of a broader pattern of biological regulation, where living organisms developed ways to sustain themselves in environments where replacement was limited and conditions were often unpredictable. And in that setting, the ability to reuse internal resources would have been especially valuable, because it allowed the body to conserve energy while still maintaining its structure. And this connection between maintenance and resource management is an important part of the story, because it shows that healing is not only about correcting what has already gone wrong, but about preventing unnecessary loss and supporting efficiency over time. And this perspective also helps explain why these processes are often difficult to notice directly, because they do not produce immediate or dramatic changes, but instead contribute to a gradual sense of stability that becomes apparent only when it is disrupted. And in modern life, this disruption can take many forms, not necessarily as severe damage, but as a pattern of conditions that do not fully support the body's internal timing, such as irregular schedules, continuous intake of information, and reduced periods of true rest, all of which can influence how consistently these maintenance processes are able to proceed. And when that consistency is reduced, the system does not disappear, but it may operate with less coordination, leaving small amounts of imbalance uncorrected for longer periods, and over time, this can create the impression that recovery requires something additional, when in fact the underlying processes are still present. though not fully supported by the surrounding environment, and this does not mean that all aspects of health can be explained by these internal mechanisms alone, because the body is also influenced by external factors that can exceed its capacity to maintain balance, but it does suggest that a significant portion of what we experience as stability depends on processes that are already active, working quietly beneath the level of awareness. And when we connect this back to the earlier discussion of sleep and rhythm, it becomes clear that these maintenance systems do not operate in isolation, but are influenced by the same patterns that guide other forms of recovery, meaning that the effectiveness of internal cleanup is not determined only by its presence, but by the conditions that allow it to align with the body's broader cycles. And so, as we continue to explore this layer, the idea of a hidden healing system becomes less about discovering a single mechanism, and more about recognizing a network of continuous processes that sustain the body through careful management of its own components, ensuring that what remains is functional enough to support life across time, even when conditions are not ideal. If we bring these pieces together, the quiet work of clearing, recycling, and maintaining internal quality begins to reveal a pattern that is both simple and easily overlooked, because it does not depend on dramatic change, but on whether the body is given enough continuity to carry out processes that are already built into it. And this is where the idea of autophagy, the cellular self-cleaning that has been described in modern biology, connects back to the broader theme of this video, not as an isolated mechanism, but as one example of how the body sustains itself through ongoing renewal. And when we consider how this process fits into the larger system, it becomes clear that it does not operate independently of other conditions, but is influenced by the same rhythms and signals that guide sleep, energy use, and internal regulation, meaning that it is not simply something that can be turned on or off at will, but something that unfolds within a context shaped by time, activity, and rest. And this returns us once again to the evolutionary setting, where the body was not exposed to constant input, but moved through cycles of availability and scarcity, effort and recovery, which would have provided a natural variation in internal conditions, allowing processes of breakdown and renewal to occur in a way that balanced the demands placed on the organism, and within that variation, the body could maintain its internal quality over long periods, not by achieving perfect conditions, but by allowing enough fluctuation for its maintenance systems to function. And this is an important point, because it suggests that stability does not come from holding the body in a fixed state, but from allowing it to move through patterns that support its internal work. And when these patterns are present, the processes that maintain cellular integrity can accumulate their effects over time, gradually preserving function without the need for constant intervention. And yet in modern environments, where patterns can become more uniform in some ways and more irregular in others, the signals that guide these processes may no longer align as clearly, and although the mechanisms themselves remain active, they may not always operate with the same coordination, which can lead to a subtle form of imbalance, where small inefficiencies are not fully corrected, and this does not immediately result in failure, because the system is designed to tolerate variation, but it may reduce the sense of continuity that allows recovery to be felt as a complete process. And this brings us back to the central question of this section, because if a significant part of healing involves the body managing its own internal components through processes like autophagy, then the absence of these processes in a prescription does not mean that they are absent from the body, but that they belong to a different category of function, one that operates continuously rather than being applied at a specific moment. And this distinction helps clarify why the idea of a free healing system can be both accurate and misleading at the same time, because it is not a tool that can be used independently of context, but a set of processes that depend on conditions that have been shaped across a long evolutionary history. And when those conditions are present, even in partial form, the system continues its work quietly, maintaining the internal environment in a way that supports life over time. And as this part comes to a close, the focus shifts once again, from identifying a single mechanism to understanding a pattern, where healing is not introduced from outside, but emerges from the ongoing effort of the body to preserve itself, moment by moment, through processes that are too constant to stand out, yet too essential to be absent. There are moments when the body produces sensations that feel uncomfortable, disruptive, or even alarming, and the immediate instinct is often to suppress them as quickly as possible. because discomfort is usually interpreted as a sign that something has gone wrong. Yet if we look more carefully, some of these responses may not be simple errors, but part of a broader pattern through which the body attempts to manage change. And this does not mean that all discomfort is beneficial or that it should be ignored, but it does suggest that certain reactions may carry a function that is not always obvious at first. And this becomes easier to understand when we consider that the body does not communicate in words, but through signals that reflect internal conditions. And these signals are shaped by long evolutionary pressures where rapid detection of imbalance could support survival, even if the signals themselves were not precise in the way modern measurement would require. And among these signals are experiences such as fatigue, mild inflammation, or temporary loss of appetite, which can arise during periods of strain. And although they are often seen only as problems to be eliminated, they may also represent shifts in how the body is allocating its resources, directing energy away from certain activities and toward others that are more immediately important for maintaining stability. And when we return once again to earlier human environments, this type of response would have been part of a larger adaptive system where the body had to balance competing demands under conditions that were often unpredictable. And in that context, reducing activity, altering appetite, or initiating immune responses could help the organism conserve energy and focus on internal processes that supported recovery. Even if those responses were experienced as unpleasant, and yet it is important to remain careful here, because these signals are not always reliable indicators of what is beneficial, and in some cases, they can become exaggerated or persist longer than needed, especially in environments that differ from those in which they evolved. And this is where the modern context introduces complexity, because the same signals that once helped guide behavior may now be triggered under different conditions, or may interact with patterns of life that extend or amplify them, leading to experiences that are less clearly connected to their original function. And this can create confusion about whether a given response is helping or hindering, and it also reinforces the tendency to view all discomfort as something that must be removed immediately, without considering the possibility that some of these responses may be part of a broader process that is still unfolding. And so the aim here is not to redefine discomfort as inherently positive, but to place it within a wider frame, where the body is constantly adjusting its internal state, sometimes producing signals that reflect those adjustments. And when we think about healing in this context, it becomes less about eliminating every sign of imbalance and more about understanding how the body navigates those imbalances over time, maintaining function through a combination of responses that can include both restoration and temporary disruption. And this perspective aligns with the idea that the body's healing system is not a single pathway, but a network of processes that include both supportive and corrective elements, some of which are quiet and barely noticeable, while others are more visible and more difficult to ignore. And as we begin this next stage of the exploration, the focus is not on labeling these signals as good or bad, but on understanding how they fit into the larger pattern of how the body maintains itself, and how that pattern may be shaped by conditions that have changed across the long history of human life. If we continue to observe these responses without rushing to define them too quickly, it becomes possible to notice that many of the body's signals are not designed to provide clear explanations, but to shift behavior in ways that may have supported survival in earlier environments. And this distinction matters because a signal does not need to be precise in order to be useful. It only needs to be effective enough to guide the organism away from conditions that increase risk and toward those that support stability. And when we consider this in the context of sensations such as fatigue or temporary discomfort, it becomes easier to see how they might function as broad indicators rather than exact measurements, encouraging a reduction in activity or a change in focus, even when the underlying cause is not fully understood. And in earlier human settings, where direct analysis of internal states was not possible, such general signals would have provided a practical way to influence behavior without requiring detailed knowledge. And over long periods, systems that could prompt appropriate responses, even if they were not perfectly accurate, would have been more likely to persist, shaping the way the body communicates its needs. And yet this form of communication can become more complex in modern life, where the environment includes patterns that differ significantly from those in which these signals evolved, such as extended periods of mental effort without corresponding physical activity, irregular exposure to light, and continuous engagement with information, all of which can influence how signals are generated and interpreted, sometimes leading to a situation where the body produces responses that do not align clearly with the context in which they occur, and this can create a sense of uncertainty, where it is not always clear whether a signal reflects an immediate need for adjustment or a mismatch between internal expectations and external conditions. And when this uncertainty persists, the tendency to suppress signals quickly can become stronger, because discomfort without clear meaning is difficult to tolerate, and yet this suppression does not remove the underlying processes that generated the signal in the first place. It only alters how they are expressed or perceived. And this brings us back to the idea of healing as an ongoing process. Because if the body is constantly adjusting its internal state, then signals are part of that adjustment, not separate from it, and while not all signals are beneficial or accurate, they still represent attempts by the body to manage its condition, even if those attempts are shaped by factors that no longer match the original environment. And this perspective does not suggest that discomfort should be accepted without question, but that it may be useful to recognize that some of the body's responses are part of a broader pattern of regulation, where the goal is not to achieve perfect comfort at every moment, but to maintain a workable balance over time. And when we consider how this pattern fits into the larger theme of a hidden healing system, it becomes clear that such a system would not always appear as something pleasant or easy to recognize, because it operates through both supportive and corrective mechanisms, some of which may feel neutral, while others may feel disruptive, and the presence of these signals does not necessarily indicate failure, but rather reflects the body's ongoing effort to navigate a complex set of conditions, adjusting continuously in response to both internal and external changes. And so as we move forward, the focus remains on understanding how these signals relate to the processes that sustain life, and how the interpretation of those signals may be influenced by the environment in which the body now exists, which may differ in important ways from the one in which these systems were originally shaped. If these signals are part of an ongoing effort to guide behavior and maintain balance, then the final layer to consider is how they interact over time, because no single response exists in isolation, and what the body does in one moment can influence what it does next, creating patterns that either support stability or gradually move it further away. And this is where the idea of healing becomes more complex, because it is not only about individual reactions, but about how those reactions accumulate, overlap, and sometimes interfere with one another. And when we return again to the evolutionary context, this accumulation would have taken place within environments that provided relatively consistent cues, allowing the body to form patterns that aligned with external conditions, reinforcing responses that supported survival and gradually adjusting those that did not. And within that setting, signals such as fatigue, hunger, or discomfort would have been integrated into a broader rhythm of activity and rest, contributing to a cycle in which the body could recover in stages, even if each stage was not clearly defined. And this integration is important, because it allows the body's efforts to build upon each other, creating continuity rather than fragmentation. And yet in modern life, this continuity can become more difficult to maintain, as signals arise in contexts that do not always support the responses they were designed to produce, such as feeling tired in environments that require continued alertness, or experiencing discomfort in situations where rest is delayed. And when this mismatch occurs repeatedly, the relationship between signal and response can begin to weaken, leading to patterns where signals are either ignored, overridden, or expressed in ways that are less clearly connected to their original function. And this does not mean that the system has stopped working, but that its outputs are no longer being integrated in the same way. And over time, this can create a form of internal disorganization, where the body continues to generate signals and adjustments, but those adjustments do not accumulate into a stable pattern, instead being interrupted or redirected before they can contribute fully to recovery. And this fragmentation can make it difficult to recognize the presence of an underlying healing system, because the outcomes it produces are less consistent and less noticeable, even though the processes themselves are still active. And this brings us back to the central idea that healing is not a single event, but a pattern of coordination across time, where signals, responses, and environmental conditions interact to shape how the body maintains itself. And when that coordination is supported, even imperfectly, the body can move toward a more stable state. But when it is repeatedly disrupted, the the same processes may continue without producing a clear sense of resolution. And so the question that remains is not whether the body still produces signals or attempts to adjust, but whether those signals are able to form a coherent pattern that leads toward recovery, or whether they remain scattered, reflecting a system that is active but not fully aligned with the conditions in which it now operates. And this distinction will become even more important as we move into the next stage, where the focus shifts from individual responses to the broader mismatch between the human body and the modern environment that surrounds it. The modern world often gives the impression that the human body has become weaker, less stable, or strangely unreliable, not because people are facing the same forms of danger that shaped earlier human life, but because the conditions surrounding the body have changed faster than the body itself. And this difference matters because the body still carries rhythms, expectations, and regulatory systems formed across a very long evolutionary history, while daily life now asks it to function inside environments that are brighter at night, more sedentary during the day, more mentally demanding, less physically varied, and often less predictable in the signals that once helped organize activity and recovery. And when those older systems continue operating inside these newer conditions, the result is not necessarily immediate breakdown, but a quieter form of mismatch, where the body is still attempting to preserve balance, still trying to regulate energy, sleep, immune activity, and repair, but doing so in a setting that constantly interrupts or blurs the cues it depends on. And this can create the familiar feeling that the body is never fully restored, never fully tired at the right time, never fully alert when it should be, and never entirely settled, as though some part of its internal timing has been pushed slightly out of place. And when we look at this through the long lens of human evolution, the problem becomes easier to understand, because the body was not shaped in offices, under electric light, in climate-controlled rooms, or under schedules that separate movement into short isolated sessions while keeping the rest of the day physically still, but in environments where movement was distributed more naturally, where light changed gradually, where food timing was less rigid, and where the boundary between activity and rest was more clearly marked by the external world. And within those older conditions, many of the body's recovery systems would have received stronger and more consistent guidance, allowing small adjustments to accumulate into a more stable pattern. Whereas in modern settings, those adjustments may still occur, but often under competing pressures that reduce their clarity. And this is one reason why so many people can feel exhausted and overstimulated at the same time, physically underused yet mentally overextended, surrounded by convenience yet lacking the sense of recovery that convenience seems as though it should provide. And this does not mean that modern life is simply harmful in every sense, because it has also reduced many immediate dangers and extended human survival in ways that earlier humans could not have imagined. But it does mean that the background systems of the body are now operating in circumstances that do not always resemble the ones in which they were shaped. And when this happens, the body may continue to function, but with more friction, more fragmentation, and less visible continuity in its healing processes, and that friction is often mistaken for weakness, when it may be closer to misalignment, a state in which the body is not failing in absolute terms, but is being asked to interpret signals that arrive out of sequence or without enough consistency to guide its deeper rhythms. And once this possibility is considered, many ordinary experiences begin to look different, because persistent tiredness, unstable appetite, shallow rest, diffuse discomfort, and the strange feeling of being physically present but not fully recovered may not always point to a single defect, but to a broader environment that keeps interrupting the body's slower forms of maintenance before they can gather into something whole. And this is why the modern mismatch matters so much for the title of this video, because the body's free healing system may still be there, still active, still trying to preserve internal order, but often doing its work in fragments, under conditions that allow it to survive, yet not always to recover with the depth, rhythm, and clarity that its long history prepared it to expect. If this mismatch continues day after day, it does not usually appear as a sudden failure, but as a gradual shift in how the body experiences time, effort, and recovery, where the boundaries between different states begin to blur, and this blurring is often subtle enough that it is difficult to identify a single cause, because nothing seems clearly broken, yet nothing feels fully aligned. And this is where the modern environment exerts one of its most persistent influences, not by removing the body's ability to heal, but by altering the signals that guide when and how that healing takes place. And when we consider how many of these signals have changed, the scale of the shift becomes easier to see, as light is no longer tied to the natural cycle of day and night, but can be extended at will, as movement is no longer distributed throughout the day, but often concentrated into limited periods. And as mental engagement continues without clear pauses, creating a situation where the body is exposed to a continuous stream of input that does not always match the patterns it evolved to interpret. And under these conditions, the body does not stop regulating itself, but the timing of that regulation can become less stable, leading to a form of internal drift, where processes that once aligned more closely with each other begin to move slightly out of phase. And this can affect how energy is used, how sleep unfolds, and how recovery accumulates, not in a dramatic or easily measurable way, but in a gradual and distributed manner that becomes noticeable only over longer periods. And this is why many people experience a kind of persistent imbalance that is difficult to describe, where fatigue does not fully resolve, rest does not feel complete, and the sense of being restored remains just out of reach, even when there are no clear signs of acute illness. And this does not suggest that the body is incapable of recovery, but that the conditions required for that recovery to consolidate are not consistently present. And when we return once more to the evolutionary perspective, this makes sense, because the body was shaped to operate within environments that provided repeated and predictable cues, allowing its internal processes to align over time, whereas in modern life, those cues can vary from day to day, creating a situation where the body must continuously adjust without ever fully settling into a stable rhythm. And this constant adjustment can itself become a form of strain, not because it is extreme, but because it is ongoing, requiring the body to remain in a state of partial adaptation without reaching a point of full resolution. And this helps explain why the sense of recovery can feel incomplete even when the basic conditions of rest, food, and safety are present. Because recovery is not only about having access to these conditions, but about how they are organized across time, and whether they allow the body's slower processes to align and accumulate. And when that alignment is disrupted, the same processes may continue, but their effects may remain fragmented, never fully integrating into a clear sense of restoration. And so, as we continue this exploration, the focus shifts toward understanding not only what the body is doing, but how the structure of daily life shapes the way those efforts are expressed, and whether that structure allows the body's inherent systems to come together into something that can be felt, or keeps them dispersed across moments that never quite connect. If this fragmentation continues over longer periods, it begins to shape not only how the body feels in isolated moments, but how it experiences continuity across days. And this is where the deeper effect of mismatch becomes more visible, because the body does not rely on single episodes of recovery, but on the accumulation of many small adjustments that gradually reinforce stability. And when those adjustments are repeatedly interrupted, delayed, or redirected, the overall pattern can begin to lose coherence, not in a way that produces immediate failure, but in a way that reduces the clarity of recovery, making it harder for the body to return to a state that feels complete. And this can be understood by thinking of the body as a system that depends on alignment across multiple processes, where sleep, energy use, immune activity, internal timing, and tissue maintenance all interact over time. And when these processes move together, even imperfectly, they can support each other, allowing recovery to build. But when they drift apart, each may still function, though without contributing fully to the others, and this lack of integration can create the impression that effort is not leading to restoration, even though the body is continuously working to maintain balance. And when we return again to the long history of human life, this idea of alignment becomes easier to understand, because earlier environments provided stronger external cues that helped coordinate these internal processes, allowing patterns to repeat with enough consistency that the body could anticipate and prepare for them, whereas in modern life, those cues are often weakened or replaced by artificial ones that do not always follow the same rhythm, leading to a situation where the body must constantly recalibrate without ever fully settling into a stable cycle. And this ongoing recalibration can itself become a form of background strain, not because it is intense, but because it is continuous, requiring the body to remain in a state of adjustment rather than resolution, and over time, this can affect how recovery is experienced, making it feel incomplete, delayed, or inconsistent, even when no single factor appears to be responsible. And this is one reason why people can sleep and still feel unfinished, rest and still feel slightly burdened, pause and still not feel as though the body has fully caught up with itself, because the problem is not always the total absence of healing, but the absence of enough continuity for healing to accumulate into something noticeable. And this distinction matters because it shifts the question away from whether the body still possesses ancient systems of self-maintenance and toward whether the surrounding structure of daily life allows those systems to reinforce one another across time, or keeps them active in fragments that never fully converge. And when we think about the body in this way, many familiar experiences take on a different shape, because persistent tiredness, uneven appetite, restless sleep, diffuse soreness, or the vague sensation of being present but not restored may not always point to a single defect hidden somewhere inside the organism, but to a broader pattern in which the organism is spending too much of its energy adapting and too little of it consolidating. And this does not mean the body has become weak in any absolute sense, nor does it mean that modern life has erased its deeper capacities, because the body remains remarkably adaptive and continues to preserve function under conditions very different from those in which it evolved. But adaptation is not the same as ease, and survival is not the same as resolution, and a body that successfully gets through a day is not necessarily a body that has completed the quieter work required to feel deeply restored by the end of it. And once this becomes clear, the hidden cost of mismatch appears less dramatic but more persistent, because it is paid in small unfinished processes, small delays in internal timing, small interruptions in maintenance, and small failures of accumulation that on their own may seem trivial, yet over long stretches of life can alter the felt texture of being alive, making the body seem unreliable when it may instead be overburdened by a world that keeps changing the rules under which its oldest systems learn to operate. And this is why the idea of a hidden healing system can be difficult to recognize in modern conditions, because the system is still present, still active, still attempting to preserve internal order, but often doing so in a fragmented way, without the continuity needed for its effects to become fully apparent. And this does not mean that recovery is impossible, but that it may depend more heavily on whether the patterns of daily life allow small processes to connect and build upon each other, rather than remaining isolated. And when those connections are present, even in partial form, the body can begin to regain a sense of coherence, not through sudden change, but through the gradual alignment of its internal rhythms. And as this part comes to a close, the question becomes more focused, because it is no longer only about the existence of a healing system, but about whether the structure of modern life allows that system to operate as a continuous pattern, or keeps it dispersed across moments that never fully come together into something that can be felt as recovery. There is a quiet assumption in modern life that the human body should be capable of maintaining a steady level of performance across long stretches of time, as if energy, attention, and physical stability could be held at a constant level without interruption, and when this expectation is not met, it is often interpreted as a weakness or a failure of the body to keep up with demand. Yet when we return again to the longer history of human existence, this expectation begins to appear less like a natural standard and more like a recent construction, because the body was not shaped in environments that required continuous output, but in ones that demanded variation, where periods of effort were followed by periods of reduced activity, and where recovery was not something that occurred after everything else was complete, but something that was interwoven with the rhythm of daily life. And this difference matters because it suggests that the body's design is not centered around sustaining a single state for as long as possible, but around moving between states in a way that allows different processes to take place at different times. And when this movement is present, the body can distribute its work more effectively, allocating energy toward action when needed and toward maintenance when conditions allow. But when this movement is reduced or replaced by prolonged uniformity, whether that uniformity takes the form of extended sitting, continuous mental engagement, or sustained exposure to the same type of stimulus, the body may still function, but it does so under conditions that do not fully match the patterns it evolved to handle. and this can lead to a situation where certain processes are delayed, not because they are absent, but because the conditions that normally signal their priority have not yet appeared. And this is where the idea of a hidden healing system becomes more grounded. Because if many forms of recovery depend on transitions between states, rather than on a single state held for a long time, then the absence of those transitions can quietly reduce the effectiveness of the system, even if all the necessary components are still present. And when we look at this through the lens of everyday experience, it becomes easier to recognize, because many people notice that the body responds differently when movement is varied rather than fixed, when attention is allowed to shift rather than remain locked in one direction, and when rest is not simply the absence of activity, but a change in the kind of activity that is taking place. And these observations align with a broader biological pattern, where systems function best not under constant demand, but under conditions that allow for alternation, for the rising and falling of activity, for the shifting of internal priorities over time. And yet modern life often encourages the opposite, promoting consistency, efficiency, and uninterrupted output as markers of success, which can create a subtle tension between what the body is being asked to do and what it is structured to sustain. And this tension does not always produce immediate breakdown, because the body is capable of adapting, but it can reduce the clarity of its internal rhythms, making it more difficult for recovery to occur in a way that feels complete. And so, as we begin this next part of the exploration, the focus shifts toward understanding how the expectation of constant performance may itself be one of the quiet factors that interferes with the body's natural patterns of maintenance, not by removing its capacity to heal, but by limiting the conditions under which that capacity can be fully expressed. If the body depends on movement between states rather than on a single uninterrupted mode of functioning, then one of the deepest misunderstandings of modern life may be the belief that stability comes from holding everything steady for as long as possible. Because in biological terms, stability is often produced not by sameness, but by rhythm, by alternation, and by the ability to shift internal priorities as conditions change. And this is easier to see when we think about how many systems in the body already work in cycles rather than in flat lines. As alertness rises and falls, hunger appears and recedes, temperature changes across the day, and sleep itself unfolds in stages rather than as one continuous state. And these patterns suggest that the body is not organized around permanent output, but around repeated transitions that allow different forms of work to happen at different times. And when those transitions occur with enough regularity, the body can distribute its effort more intelligently, allocating energy toward outward action when the environment demands it, and toward internal maintenance when conditions make that possible. And this arrangement would have made deep evolutionary sense, because for most of human history, activity was not evenly spread across identical hours, but changed with terrain, weather, light, social conditions, and the practical demands of survival, meaning that the body developed within a world where variation was normal and even necessary. And within that variation, systems of repair and restoration did not need to compete endlessly with performance, because there were recurring moments when the body could lower one priority and raise another, allowing maintenance to proceed not in isolation, but in the spaces created by natural shifts in behavior. And when we compare this with many forms of modern life, the contrast becomes clearer, because now it is common for people to remain in the same posture for long periods, to maintain the same narrow type of attention for much of the day, and to move through schedules that value continuity of productivity more than continuity of biological rhythm. And this can create a condition in which the body shared in one dominant mode for longer than it was ever shaped to prefer, not necessarily under extreme stress, but under a subtler form of monotony that limits the transitions through which many processes of maintenance would normally be supported. And this helps explain why the body can feel dull, heavy, or strangely unfinished even when it has not been pushed to its absolute limit, because exhaustion is not the only sign of strain, and sometimes the problem is not excess intensity, but insufficient variation, not too much movement, but too little change, not too much effort in one dramatic sense, but too many hours spent in the same kind of effort without enough alternation to let other systems take their turn. And this brings us back again to the title of the video, because the body's hidden healing system may not be absent so much as crowded out, still operating, still trying to preserve internal order, but doing so while the outer structure of life keeps asking for continuity in forms that reduce the opportunities for deeper maintenance to gather momentum. And this is why a person can be technically resting, yet not truly shifting into restoration, can pause without feeling renewed, and can complete a day without sensing that the body has fully reset. Because the issue may lie not only in the amount of effort, but in the pattern of effort, and whether that pattern still includes enough contrast, enough alternation, and enough movement between states for the body's older systems to recognize the moment when inward work can proceed more completely. And once this is understood, the expectation of constant performance begins to look less like discipline and more like a mismatch, not because the body cannot adapt to it for a while, but because adaptation under such conditions may come at the quiet cost of reduced coherence, where recovery continues in fragments rather than arriving as a clear and settled state. And so the deeper question becomes whether the body is failing to keep up, or whether it is being asked to remain in one mode for too long, in a world that rewards constancy even though the organism itself was built for cycles. If the body was built for cycles rather than constancy, then the final step is to recognize how deeply this changes the meaning of strength, because strength in modern culture is often imagined as the ability to remain unchanged, to stay productive, alert, efficient, and physically available for as long as possible, with as little fluctuation as possible. Yet in biological terms, that image is incomplete, because a living body does not remain strong by refusing variation, but by moving through variation without losing its larger coherence. And this is an important distinction, because it suggests that endurance is not simply the ability to continue, but the ability to alternate, to rise into effort and return from it, to shift from outward action into inward repair, and then back again, without becoming trapped in one state for too long. And when we return once more to the longer human story, this kind of strength makes much more sense. Because human beings did not evolve in conditions that demanded uninterrupted output from morning to night under the same narrow set of signals, but in environments where demands changed across terrain, weather, light, danger, and opportunity, meaning that the body would have needed to preserve flexibility more than constancy. And within that flexibility, healing could remain woven into ordinary life, not as a separate activity added afterward, but as part of the repeated transitions through which the organism maintained itself. And this helps explain why the body often responds better to patterns that include contrast than to those that demand uniformity, because contrast creates thresholds, and thresholds allow systems to reorganize, making it easier for one mode of activity to recede and another to take its place. Whereas prolonged sameness can keep the body suspended in a narrow band of function that is enough for continuation, but not always enough for deeper restoration, and this can be felt in many ordinary ways. In the strange heaviness that comes from sitting too long rather than moving too much, in the dull fatigue that follows continuous attention more than brief intense effort, and in the sense of being physically present but internally unfinished, after a day that required long steadiness without clear transition. And these experiences are important because they suggest that the body's hidden systems of maintenance do not merely require the absence of effort, but depend on the presence of change, on the body being allowed to shift states clearly enough that internal priorities can be rearranged. And when that rearrangement happens, even partial forms of recovery can begin to accumulate into something more coherent. But when it is delayed again and again, the body may keep functioning while carrying an increasing burden of unfinished maintenance beneath the surface. And this is one reason modern people can feel as though they are always close to recovery, but never quite inside it. Because what is missing may not be effort, motivation, or even time in the simplest sense, but the biological permission to change states fully enough for older repair systems to do their quieter work. And this brings the argument of this truck into clearer focus. Because the body's hidden healing system is not only about what happens during sleep or inside cells or through immune regulation, but also about whether daily life still contains the transitions through which those systems were meant to coordinate. And if those transitions are reduced, flattened, or constantly postponed, then recovery may continue, but as a scattered background process rather than a complete felt experience. And so the deeper lesson here is not that the body is weak because it cannot remain constant, but that the expectation of constancy may itself be one of the forces that keeps the body from expressing its older strengths in a clear and continuous way. And if that is true, then what looks like failure may sometimes be a body still trying to live by rhythms that the modern world no longer makes easy to follow. As the idea of a hidden healing system becomes clearer, another question begins to emerge, one that is less about biology and more about how modern systems of knowledge are organized. Because if so much of the body's maintenance depends on processes that are always active, distributed across time, and influenced by conditions rather than single interventions, then it becomes easier to understand why these processes rarely appear in the language of prescriptions, not because they are unimportant, but because they do not fit easily into the structure that prescriptions are designed for. And this distinction matters, because modern medicine has developed in a way that prioritizes what can be clearly identified, measured, and applied in a controlled manner, focusing on interventions that can be standardized, tested, and adjusted with precision, which has led to extraordinary advances in treating acute conditions, managing infections, repairing injuries, and extending life in ways that would have been impossible in earlier periods of human history. And yet within this framework, processes that are continuous, context-dependent, and not easily isolated into a single variable can become less visible. Not because they are absent, but because they are more difficult to represent within systems that depend on clear inputs and outputs. And when we return again to the body itself, this contrast becomes easier to see, because the body does not operate through isolated commands, but through networks of interactions that shift gradually over time, where sleep, internal regulation, cellular maintenance, and environmental signals all influence one another in ways that cannot always be separated into independent components. And this makes it challenging to translate these processes into something that can be prescribed in the same way as a specific medication or treatment, because there is no single dose, no single timing, and no single pathway that can capture the full complexity of how the body maintains itself. And this does not reduce their importance, but it does change how they are represented, often placing them outside the direct focus of clinical intervention, even though they continue to operate beneath it, supporting the baseline from which more targeted treatments can act. And when we consider this in the broader context of human history, it becomes clear that this separation between intervention and background process is relatively recent, because for most of the time that humans have existed, there was no formal system to distinguish between what the body was doing on its own and what might be added from outside. And survival depended on both, on the body's internal capacity to regulate itself, and on whatever external resources were available, without a strict boundary between them. And in modern life, that boundary has become more defined, which allows for more precise and effective treatments, but can also create the impression that healing begins only when something is prescribed, when in reality, much of it has already been underway, continuing quietly regardless of whether it is named or measured. And this brings us back to the title of the video, because the idea that a powerful system does not appear in prescriptions is not a sign that it is hidden or neglected, but a reflection of the fact that it belongs to a different category of biological function, one that operates continuously rather than being applied at specific moments. And this distinction is important for understanding both the strengths and the limits of modern approaches, because while targeted interventions can address specific problems with remarkable effectiveness, they do not replace the underlying processes that sustain the body over time, and those processes, though less visible, remain essential, shaping how the body responds, recovers, and maintains itself in ways that cannot always be captured within the structure of a prescription. And as this part begins, the focus is not on opposing these two perspectives, but on understanding how they relate and why something so fundamental can remain present without being formally written down. If we stay with this distinction a little longer, the difference becomes even clearer, because a prescription is usually designed to direct attention towards something specific, a defined substance, a defined action, a defined target, and often a defined duration, while the body's deeper maintenance systems do not operate in that narrow form, but across many layers at once, over long periods of time, and often in response to conditions rather than commands. And this is one reason the language of medicine and the language of ordinary biological recovery do not always overlap, even when they are describing parts of the same human body, because medicine is often strongest when it can identify a particular problem and intervene in a particular way, whereas the body's quieter healing systems are often strongest when they are allowed to coordinate many functions at once. including sleep timing, immune balance, tissue maintenance, energy allocation, and cellular cleanup, none of which can always be reduced to a single lever that can be pulled from outside with the same precision. And when we view this through the long history of human life, the contrast becomes even more understandable because the body's internal systems were shaped across vast stretches of time during which no formal medical structure existed, which means those systems did not evolve to depend on explicit instructions from outside, but to operate continuously under changing circumstances, adjusting themselves through feedback, rhythm, and gradual correction, and in that sense they belong to a slower and more distributed kind of intelligence, one that is built into the organism itself rather than applied to it from outside. And this is why the absence of such processes from a prescription should not be mistaken for absence from the body. Because what a prescription records is not everything that matters, but what can be clearly directed, timed, and standardized in a clinical context, and many foundational processes do not fit that format, not because they lack importance, but because their effects depend too heavily on pattern, continuity, and interaction to be written down as one simple instruction. And this also helps explain why modern people can sometimes feel a gap between treatment and recovery, because treatment may address one clearly defined part of a problem, while the broader experience of restoration still depends on slower background processes that are not captured in the same direct language, and that gap can create the impression that something has been missed, when in fact two different layers are at work at the same time, one targeted and explicit, the other distributed and implicit, and neither fully replaces the other, because a body may need focused intervention in one moment and still rely on its own deeper systems to rebuild coherence afterward. Just as a wound may be cleaned and protected from outside while the closing of tissue, the regulation of inflammation, and the broader stabilization of the organism continue from within. And when we return again to the evolutionary frame, this layered picture becomes especially important, because for most of human history the body had to survive under conditions where direct intervention was limited, uneven, or absent, so any organism that could not maintain a strong baseline of self-regulation would have been at a profound disadvantage, and over time that would favor bodies that could preserve internal order through many overlapping mechanisms, rather than through one dramatic process alone. And this is why the hidden healing system described in the title is best understood not as a forgotten cure that modern medicine somehow ignored, but as a foundational layer of human biology that medicine often works alongside, supports, or depends upon without always naming it directly. And once this is understood, the absence of these processes from a prescription begins to seem less strange, because prescriptions are not written to describe the entire logic of life inside the body, only to guide a particular intervention within it, and the deeper continuity of bodily repair remains present before, during, and after that intervention, often without being formally stated, and this changes the emotional meaning of the title as well, because what sounds at first like a hidden secret turns out to be something quieter and more grounded, a recognition that the body has always been carrying forward its own maintenance through mechanisms too constant, too dispersed, and too context-dependent to fit easily into the structure of a written order. And as this part comes to a close, the question becomes more subtle again, because it is no longer simply why this free healing system is missing from prescriptions, but whether the modern habit of looking only for what can be prescribed has made it harder to notice the slower forms of recovery that have been accompanying human life all along. If we carry this distinction to its final point, then the question of why the body's deepest recovery systems do not appear in prescriptions begins to reveal something larger about how modern people have learned to recognize reality, because what is most visible, most measurable, and most immediate often receives the strongest attention, while slower background processes can remain unnoticed even when they are essential, and this is not only true in medicine, but in many parts of life, where dramatic interventions are easier to see than the quiet conditions that make those interventions effective. And when we apply this to the human body, the pattern becomes very clear, because a prescription usually belongs to a moment of focused action, a moment when something specific is identified and addressed, and that kind of action can be life-saving, precise, and indispensable. Yet the body that receives that intervention is never empty before it begins, as it is already regulating temperature, redistributing energy, maintaining circulation, adjusting immune activity, cleaning damaged cellular material, shifting hormone levels, and preparing tissues either to resist further damage or to begin restoring themselves. And this means that the written instruction does not enter a passive object, but an organism already in motion, already attempting to preserve life through systems that were shaped long before modern clinical language existed. And once we understand this, the absence of a free healing system from a prescription no longer seems like a contradiction, because prescriptions are not designed to describe everything the body is doing, only to add a specific external influence to a body whose deeper logic is already unfolding. And in that sense, the difference is not between healing and non-healing, but between what can be directly ordered and what can only be supported by conditions, patterns, and time. And this brings us back once again to the evolutionary frame that has guided the whole video, because for most of human history, the human organism survived without any stable system of written treatment, which means that the baseline work of regulation, repair, and internal preservation had to be built into the body itself. And even now, in a world of advanced medicine, that older layer has not disappeared, but continues underneath every intervention, making it possible for treatment to have something to work with, something to support, something to guide towards stability rather than collapse. And this is why the title should not be understood as a rejection of medicine, but as a reminder of scale. Because medicine can be extraordinarily powerful in changing outcomes, preventing death, controlling infection, reducing danger, and addressing specific conditions, yet it still enters a body whose most constant work is not written in the prescription pad, but carried in cells, rhythms, tissues, and internal feedback systems that continue before, during, and after any named treatment. And perhaps one reason modern people find this difficult to feel is that these older systems are not dramatic enough to announce themselves clearly, as they work slowly, diffusely, and often below awareness, becoming noticeable only when their coordination is reduced, when sleep no longer restores, when fatigue lingers, when recovery feels incomplete, or when the body seems to be surviving without fully returning to itself. And under those conditions, it is tempting to imagine that healing must be something delivered from outside, in a singular form, when the deeper truth may be quieter, which is that life in the body is sustained by layers, some sharp and targeted, others ancient and continuous, and the most enduring layer is often the one least likely to be named directly, because it is not a product, not a dose, and not a single act, but the ongoing attempt of the organism to hold itself together across time. And if that is so, then the most valuable insight is not that the body contains a hidden miracle, but that human life has always depended on processes too ordinary to look miraculous, and too constant to seem extraordinary, even though without them no treatment, no intervention, and no modern system of care would have a living foundation upon which to act. And that leaves us with a gentler and more honest version of the title's promise, because the body does seem to carry a free healing system, but not in the form of one secret cure, rather as a long-evolved network of maintenance, repair, timing, and renewal that never fully stops. And perhaps the deeper question is not why it is absent from prescriptions, but whether modern life has taught us to notice only what is written down, while overlooking the quieter forms of recovery that have been sustaining human beings all along. As everything begins to settle, the idea of a hidden healing system no longer feels like a mystery waiting to be revealed, but more like a pattern that has been quietly present from the beginning, becoming visible only when attention slows down enough to notice it. And this shift matters because it changes the way the question itself is understood, moving it away from the search for a single powerful solution and toward an awareness of how the body has always sustained itself through layers of continuous activity, many of which do not produce immediate or dramatic effects, yet remain essential for the persistence of life. And when we return one final time to the long history of the human organism, it becomes clear that survival was never based on a single mechanism, but on the integration of many processes working together across time, where sleep, internal regulation, cellular maintenance, immune response, and behavioral signals all contributed to a form of stability that was never perfect, but often sufficient. And this sufficiency was what allowed human beings to move through uncertain environments, to recover from strain, and to continue despite conditions that were rarely ideal, And even now, in a world where modern medicine can intervene with precision and speed, that older layer has not been replaced, but continues underneath, shaping how the body responds to everything that happens to it, whether that influence is visible or not. And this is where the meaning of the title becomes more grounded, because the free healing system is not something separate from the body, but something that is the body, not a tool that can be used independently, but a set of ongoing processes that cannot be fully separated from the conditions in which they operate. And when those conditions allow even partial alignment, the body can gather its scattered adjustments into something that feels more complete, more settled, more coherent. But when those conditions are constantly interrupted, the same processes may continue without ever fully converging, creating the familiar sense of being almost restored, but not entirely. And this is why the final understanding is not about rejecting external help or elevating internal processes beyond their limits, but about recognizing that both exist together, that intervention and self-regulation are not opposing forces, but different layers of the same system, one acting in moments of need, the other acting continuously in the background. And when they are aligned, recovery can deepen, but when they are separated, recovery may still occur, though with less clarity. And so as this final part begins to unfold, the focus turns gently toward what remains when all explanations have been laid out, not as a conclusion that closes the question, but as a perspective that allows it to remain open, where the body is no longer seen as something waiting to be fixed, but as something that has been quietly working to preserve itself all along, asking not for perfection, but for conditions that allow its older rhythms to be felt again. If this understanding is allowed to deepen without rushing toward a conclusion, it begins to change not only how the body is viewed, but how the experience of being inside a body is interpreted over time. Because what once seemed like absence, delay, or failure can begin to appear as something quieter and more complex, where the body is still engaged in its continuous effort to preserve coherence, even when that effort does not produce a clear or immediate result. And this matters because much of modern life encourages attention toward outcomes that are visible, measurable, and quickly confirmed, while the body's deeper processes unfold in a slower register, often without sharp boundaries, and without a single moment that can be identified as the point at which healing begins or ends. And when these slower processes are compared to faster interventions, they can appear uncertain or incomplete, even though they are often the foundation upon which more visible changes depend. And when we return again to the longer human story, this difference becomes easier to hold, because for most of human existence, there were no clear markers separating illness from recovery, no precise tools to measure internal states, and no consistent external system to define when healing had occurred. And yet the body continued to regulate itself, to repair what it could, to adapt to what it could not immediately change, and to maintain enough internal order to continue. And this persistence did not depend on certainty, but on continuity, on the repeated effort of many systems working together across time. And when we bring this perspective into the present, it offers a quieter way of understanding why the body sometimes feels unresolved, because the expectation of a clear endpoint may not always match the way biological processes actually unfold. And instead of moving toward a fixed state of completion, the body often moves through phases of relative stability, adjusting as conditions shift, and maintaining function even when full restoration has not yet been achieved. And this does not mean that recovery is unimportant or unreachable, but that it may not always appear as a single moment of arrival, and this can be difficult to accept in a culture that values clear results, because it requires a different kind of attention, one that is willing to notice gradual change, partial improvement, and the quiet reorganization of internal states that may not announce themselves in obvious ways. And yet this form of attention is closer to the way the body actually operates, where healing is not introduced at a specific time, but is always in progress, sometimes more visible, sometimes less, sometimes supported by conditions that allow it to gather strength, and sometimes limited by conditions that disperse it across fragments. And this is where the relationship between the body and its environment becomes central once again, because the body does not heal in isolation, but within a context that either supports or interrupts its internal rhythms. And when that context provides enough continuity, even imperfectly, the body can begin to align its processes in a way that produces a more coherent sense of recovery. But when continuity is repeatedly disrupted, the same processes may continue without fully integrating, leaving the impression that something essential has been lost, even though it remains present beneath the surface. And this leads to a quieter, more grounded understanding of what the title has been pointing toward all along. Because the idea of a free healing system is not about discovering a hidden solution, but about recognizing a form of biological continuity that has always been there, working through cycles, patterns, and gradual adjustments rather than through singular events. And perhaps the most important shift is not in what the body is doing, but in how that activity is perceived. Because when attention moves away from the search for a single decisive change and toward the recognition of ongoing processes, the body begins to appear less like a system that fails to deliver clear outcomes, and more like a system that is always in motion, always adjusting, always maintaining as best it can within the conditions it is given. And if there is a final insight to hold on to here, it is not that the body contains a perfect or complete system of healing, but that it contains a continuous one, a system that does not stop, even when it is difficult to notice, and that continues its work quietly, asking not to be activated, but to be allowed to proceed. And so the question that remains is not whether such a system exists, but whether the patterns of modern life allow it to gather into something that can be felt, or keep it just below the threshold of awareness, present but rarely experienced as whole. As the final layer settles into place, the question that once seemed to point toward something hidden or missing begins to open in a different direction, not toward discovery, but toward recognition. Because throughout this entire journey, nothing new has been added to the body, and nothing essential has been taken away, and yet the way the body is understood has slowly shifted from something that appears to require constant correction to something that has been continuously maintaining itself all along. And this shift is quiet, but it changes the meaning of many familiar experiences, because what once felt like absence can begin to look like interruption, what once felt like failure can begin to resemble fragmentation, and what once seemed like weakness can begin to reveal itself as a system still operating under conditions that no longer fully support its rhythm. And this does not transform the body into something perfect or self-sufficient beyond all limits, because the body remains vulnerable, dependent on its environment, and sometimes in need of precise and powerful intervention, especially when conditions exceed what it can manage on its own. And this is where the role of modern medicine remains essential, not as a replacement for the body's internal systems, but as a way of supporting, correcting, or protecting those systems when they are overwhelmed. And when we hold both of these layers together, the picture becomes more complete, because healing is no longer understood as something that arrives from one direction alone, but as something that emerges from the interaction between what the body is already doing and what is sometimes added from outside. And within that interaction, the deeper continuity of the body's own processes remains constant, shaping how every intervention is received, integrated, and carried forward. And this continuity is easy to overlook because it does not announce itself in moments of intensity, but reveals itself across time, in the slow return of balance, in the gradual settling of internal states, and in the quiet persistence of life even when conditions are not ideal. And when we return one last time to the long arc of human existence, this persistence becomes the most important thread because it is what allowed human beings to survive across environments that changed, across generations that faced uncertainty, and across lives that were never fully controlled or predictable. And even now, in a world where so much can be measured, adjusted, and improved, that same persistence continues beneath the surface, not as a guarantee, but as an ongoing effort, one that does not stop simply because it is not visible. And this is where the title finally finds its place, not as a claim that there exists a single powerful cure that has been overlooked, but as a way of pointing toward a system that is too constant to be easily named, too distributed to be written in a single line, and too dependent on conditions to be reduced to a single instruction. And if there is something to take from this, it may be less about changing the body and more about changing attention. Because when attention shifts toward the patterns that support or interrupt the body's quieter work, the question becomes less about what is missing and more about what is already present, still operating, still adapting, still maintaining. And perhaps the most honest place to end is not with a final answer, but with a question that remains open. Because if the body has been carrying this continuous effort for so long, then in the world as it is now, are we living in a way that allows that effort to gather into something that can be felt, or in a way that keeps it scattered, always working but never quite allowed to become whole?